Beneath the still waters of Lake Marion lies a piece of Carolina history, the town of Ferguson. Once a thriving lumber town on the banks of the Santee River, Ferguson was built on the back of a forest, a place where the Santee River Cypress Lumber Company cut and milled cypress for decades. By the time the dam project began, the logging industry had already stripped much of the surrounding swamp. The forest that once sheltered the town was nearly gone before the flood came to finish the work. I mention Ferguson now because it reminds us how much was lost even before the basin was flooded. But this episode isn't about one town. It's about the whole landscape. A forest, a swamp, a watershed, cleared, cut, and reshaped in the name of power and progress. So we begin not with the people who moved, but with the land that changed. Dr. Hart continues his story.
Lake Marion, a lot of Lake Marion was a lot more forested in a sense than Lake Moultrie, in the fact that it was a lot of that Santee swamp. So it was kind of a different landscape. There's still a lot of pine forest, a lot of wetlands, a lot of swamp that was flooded. Don't get me wrong, in Lake Moultrie. But there were sections of what's now Lake Marion and the Santee swamp that were largely uninhabited. And so there was kind of a different dynamic when it came to land clearing. When we talk about World War II, there was a sense of urgency by 1940, certainly by 1941, to get things cleared as quickly as possible in order to get the project up and running and begin generating electricity, because it was designated as a wartime project as part of the wartime mobilization. And the idea was that it would generate electricity, which it did, to the military facilities in Charleston. But what that meant was that they never completely finished clearing Lake Marion to the extent that they wanted. Now, they cleared most of it, but there's about a 25 square mile area where Sparkleberry Swamp is, for instance, on the northern end of Lake Marion, that was never fully cleared. And even many of the logs that were lying on the ground during as they were getting the project, they bolted down with these cables because they simply didn't have time to remove everything. And when Hurricane Hugo came along, a lot of those floated to the surface and created these massive log jams on the lake. So Lake Marion, most of it was cleared, but because of that urgency, it was not quite as finished, so to speak, in terms of land clearance as Lake Moultrie.
Thousands of acres were stripped, burned, and flooded, some cleared by hand, others by machine. Still, not everything vanished. Parts of Lake Marion were never fully cleared. Sparkleberry Swamp holds stumps of cypress and tupelo, the faint skeletons of a forest drowned in the 1940s. And decades later, Hurricane Hugo would stir those waters again, reminding us that the past isn't gone, just submerged. The destruction wasn't only mechanical, it was ecological. To understand the depth of what happened, I asked Dr. Robert Hart to describe what was lost when the old Santee Swamp was cleared and drowned.
Okay, yeah, that was significant. I mean, this was the largest land clearing project in American history to this point. I mean, in American history at this point, not just in South Carolina. Over 150,000 acres clear cut to make room for Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion. Much of that was longleaf and loblolly forest. You had some mixed oak, hickory, and hardwood uplands. But a lot of that was what we think of as the old Santee Swamp. And this was a vast old growth bottomland forest. It was not, a lot of people like to call it a virgin forest. It was not a virgin forest, so to speak. There had been logging. There had been a lot of human disturbance through grazing and hunting and recreational activities, and even burning the woods traditionally. But much of that forest remained intact. And to give you a sense of just how ecologically significant it was at the time, it was believed that one of the two or three remaining populations of ivory-billed woodpeckers remained in that swamp. During the 1930s, some of the most important ornithologists of the 20th century, particularly the earliest 20th century, came to the Santee Swamp to see those ivory-billed woodpeckers. Roger Torrey Peterson was one, Jim Tanner was another, Alex Sprunt, Bob Allen, all came searching for the ivory-billed woodpecker and believed they had found evidence that ivory-billed woodpeckers still existed there. Two of the ornithologists actually said that they had seen Carolina parakeets in those swamps, though they later recanted their statement. But the idea that it was dense enough to harbor ivory-billed woodpecker populations, which needed a vast supply of old growth and large timber, gives you an idea of the density of that forest and the conditions that they found there. It wasn't just that. I mean, it was a haven for migratory species, for warblers, for waterfowl, for black bears, for deer, for some of the last wild turkeys, pure wild turkeys in North America, for bobcats, and a whole host of smaller fauna, that we often don't think about when we focus on the larger animals. So with a lot of biodiversity, today in today's language, we would talk about the ecosystem services that the old growth forests provide in terms of water quality and water filtration, in terms of it being a carbon sink.
This wasn't just any forest. It was one of the last old-growth cypress and hardwood wetlands in the Southeast, a refuge for countless species and for generations for people too.
But there was also the cultural value that came with those. People had hunted and fished in those swamps for decades. They had herded livestock, both cattle and hogs, in those swamps. They had trapped in those swamps. People had ancestors who had hid in those swamps. The swamp served as a refuge. They served as a way that people felt connected to the land, both through for recreational purposes, but also, for many people, there was a spiritual connection to that landscape. People who had grown up with that landscape and landmarks within those swamps as, part really of their sense of place. And it's hard to really articulate what that meant to the people that experienced, lived, worked, trapped, and enjoyed the Santee Swamp before it was clear cut.
The Santee Swamp was more than an ecosystem. It was memory itself, a living archive where families fished, prayed, and found belonging. When the water came, it flooded not only the land, but the sense of home that lived within it. Parts of the town of Ferguson still rise above Lake Marion's surface, traces of a legacy that refuses to sink, while the rest lingers beneath the surface, a name whispered through history, and on maps that no longer match the land. When we talk about the creation of Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie, it's easy to focus on what was lost on the surface: the forests, the homes, the farmland. But the impact of this project reached far beyond the new shorelines. The damming of the Santee River changed the flow of two major waterways, the Santee and the Cooper, and over time transformed the coast itself. Dr. Robert Hart explains how that redirection of water reshaped not only the lakes, but also South Carolina's rivers and marshlands.
There are two really important consequences to think about. One is the downstream effects on the Santee and Cooper rivers of this project. And then the other is the impact on the cleared land, which became Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie. Originally, they just called them the Santee and Pinopolis reservoirs. But those two lakes, when we talk about kind of the mixed benefits of the Santee Cooper, it's important to recognize that, we can look back and we think of this old growth forest and how majestic that must have been, and the cultural and spiritual and recreational importance they had. But then it creates these two lakes, and these two lakes or reservoirs become an entirely different landscape or waterscape, if you will. And during the 1940s and 1950s, and then 1960s and 70s, 80s, and on up until today, they become an important source of recreational and cultural activity for people who see these lakes not as a result of the horrible displacement of people and of the clear cutting of these old growth forests, but rather as a place to enjoy fishing. I mean, one of the most remarkable stories is the adaptation of the striped bass or the rockfish, which is primarily an anadromous fish that lives in the salt water and swims up the fresh water upstream in order to spawn and then returns. Well, the dam cut off that migration, but they were able to adapt by going up into the congaree, some of them into the wateree, and spawning there. And as a result, for a long time, the Santee Cooper Lakes had the only landlocked rockfish in the world. And it became not only famous in the Southeast, but famous nationally, and even to some degree lured international visitors there because of its tremendous bass fishing. I can remember even my grandfather talking about those early days and just how amazing the bass fishing was early on. And so it became an important, it wasn't just about the thrill of catching, a large striper. For a lot of people, those lakes, just like the river before and the swamps, provided an important source of food. People, even if they weren't going out on the lake per se in boats, fish from the banks, and were able to carry, fish for brim, for bass, even catfish, and it became an important staple of their diets, but also an important staple of their own recreational activity. And so that's not to diminish the ecological and cultural destruction that took place, but it is often that we look at the negatives without seeing the unexpected, consequences of this new environment, this new recreational space that was created. It's interesting that, when they were proposing this project, they listed off the potential benefits. Recreation was listed as number 8. And if you ask people now what they most know about Santee Cooper, particularly if you mention Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie, they would say fishing. They would either say bass fishing or so it's interesting, and then there are the downstream effects, right? There's the fact that the Cooper River, all of that water that had come, it's important to remember the Santee River was the second largest river in terms of volume on the East Coast, second only to the Susquehanna. It's a lot of water. And the Cooper River was not a very large river. And so you take all the Santee River's water and you divert it into the Cooper River. And it had two most apparent effects. One is it broadened the Cooper River, flooded a lot of land, particularly land that had been on former rice plantations along the Cooper River. But the other is that it took all the sediment that comes from the upstate and used to flow down into the Santee River and go out into the Atlantic Ocean to the Santee Delta, and it dumped it into Charleston Harbor, which required the Army Corps of Engineers to spend millions of dollars dredging the harbor. As a result of that, the increasing cost of the dredging of Charleston Harbor, they proposed a rediversion project. They started proposing that in the 1970s, late 60s, early 1970s. It took a while for that to come to fruition. And they finally, in the 1980s, rediverted the water, some of the water from Lake Moultrie back into the Santee River. If you think about the downstream consequences for the Santee River, we come to that settlement load again, because what happens now is that the building of, or the damming of the Santee River means that you lose the vast majority of the flow of water that had traditionally gone out the Santee River into the Atlantic Ocean, which had over centuries and centuries, millennia even, created what we would think of as the Santee Delta, which was this rich ecosystem of fresh and brackish water marshes with a whole host of flora and fauna that depended on those ecosystems. A study done recently within the last couple of decades showed that the amount of sediment loss after the dam was something around 86%. And so you can imagine what that did. It allowed for, first of all, it meant that the sediment on barrier islands and to build up those marshes is lost. And one of the things that does, of course, is it allows erosion and the diminishing of those lands, but it also allows for saltwater intrusion. And so you see everything from ghost forests to dying vegetation to the impact that it has on species that had depended on fresh water, and now you have brackish or salt water, or species that depended on brackish water, and now you've got completely salt water.
What Dr. Hart is describing is a kind of ecological domino effect. By rerouting the Santee's massive flow into the smaller Cooper River, sediment that once nourished the Santee Delta began settling in Charleston Harbor instead. The marshes that had formed over millennia started to erode, letting salt water push inland, turning living forests into ghost forests. So even decades after the land was flooded, the lakes continued to reshape the lowcountry, from the pine forests of the interior to the tidal marshes at the coast.
I wrote an article that came out several years ago about the environmental politics of this project. And in fact, environmentalists fought. They were called conservationists then, but they fought this project tooth and nail. In fact, early on, when this project was proposed in the early 20th century, and even when T.C. Williams began to promote this project in the 1920s, the voices, particularly from the Santee Delta, were very, very strong in terms of opposing, particularly those people that enjoyed duck hunting in the Santee Delta. So people argued that this was going to happen, Not only did the ornithologists who were arguing that the destruction of the Santee Swamp would impact the bird population, but hunters and sportsmen, the U.S. Biological Survey, which at the time was headed by a guy named J. Ding Darling, who was one of the creators of the duck stamp project, they spoke out vehemently against this project and foresaw all of the things that happened. Archibald Rutledge, he was the poet laureate. His plantation, Hampton Plantation, was down on the South Santee, or the southern portion of the Santee River. And he spoke out about the impact that it would have on the Santee Delta. In fact, his criticism of the project, the South Carolina State Legislature, at least the lower house, they voted to strip him of his poet laureate status because of the articles he was writing in opposition. So people spoke out against it, but the difference in the project then, and let's say if it would have been proposed now or in the 1980s or the 19, is you did not have an environmental protection agency. You did not have the same kinds of legislation that we have now, an Endangered Species Act. We didn't have anything to really, from a legal standpoint, prevent this project from going forward. And the other thing that is important to remember that I talk about in my writings about the Santee Copper is that people were really hurting during the Depression. They were poor and they were getting poorer. They were losing their homes, and that's why I always preface it with the Depression era context. People are losing their farms. Their kids are hungry. People wanted jobs. And so when people thought about, what's this going to do to ducks? What's this going to do to people that want to shoot ducks? What's this going to do to maybe an ivory-billed woodpecker that we really don't even know is there? Or centuries-old cypress and trees? Versus, can I put food on the table if the promises, that Santee Cooper is promoting come true? Can I get a job? Those things during the Depression outweighed any of the environmental concerns in a way that, they might not have later. But, historians always, we're very cautious about dealing in hypotheticals and what ifs. What we do know is that the politics of the New Deal really centered on solving the problems of the Depression, first and foremost. And though politicians like Burnett Maybank and James F. Burns, Richard Jeffries, some other state level politicians saw in this project a political advantage and the opportunity to, get this federal government funding and to take credit for that and to sell that and themselves to the people of South Carolina when it came time for election season. It wasn't difficult. It wasn't as difficult to sell to people that were hungry.
For politicians of the 1930s, the promise of jobs and electricity outweighed the warnings of environmental loss. Even the state's poet laureate, Archibald Rutledge, wrote about this tension, the hunger for progress and devastation. Rutledge wrote of farms fading and families struggling to survive. And though some spoke against the project, including a few white residents who lived near the basin, most accepted the trade-off. In the depths of the Depression, progress was easier to sell than preservation.
There were some people from out of state coming. Some of the work on the dam was done by an engineering firm out of Louisiana. And they actually lived on these kind of floating houseboats when they were doing work. Some really interesting stories about the parties they would have on those houseboats. But yeah, they would work, the land clearing. When I was first starting to do research on this, it was my PhD dissertation, and now it's part of a book that should come out soon. And I was interviewing a man that I essentially kind of grew up with, and he worked for the bank and would have to cash the checks of the people who were working in those camps. And they would actually have a money car, and then they would have another car following them with armed guards, not because of the people in the camp, but the potential of people on the way robbing them of their money. I mean, again, this is the middle of the Depression. People were desperate. And so it's interesting, but they would carry, the cash down and cash the people's checks that were clearing that land.
The work itself was grueling, but for some, it was also adventure, a chance to earn money, to travel, to be part of something larger than themselves. Men from Louisiana and beyond lived on floating camps, felling trees by day and sharing stories by night. The lake's creation was not only an act of destruction, it was a brief, strange world unto itself.
A lot of people that worked on that project have now passed. And I was fortunate enough when I was doing research early on as a graduate student, and then, somewhat later, to interview some of these folks. And they talked about, how on these kind of floating houseboats or almost house hotels, these barracks on pontoons that they would sort of float, how they would just stay up all night, playing cards, drinking moonshine, and then get up the next day and go to work. I'm not sure how much of that is actually true. That's coming from, an oral history with, I've heard several people talk about that during my interviews, but a lot of those folks were from down on the coast of Louisiana that they brought up. So they always thought that they had a good time despite the hard work they were doing engineering those dams.
The men who cleared the swamp left their mark on the land and in the stories that survive. Their work built a new South Carolina landscape, but the memory of what was lost still lingers in the water.
You go over I-95 now, and you look to the right and you look to the left when you cross over Lake Marion, and you see this vast expanse of water. And you think all of that was just beautiful forest at one time, old growth. And it gives you a sense, as far as your eye can see, largely where that water is, was once forested and part of the Santee. So, the ecological and cultural consequences were significant.
Looking back now, the lakes seem timeless, still, dark, and heavy with memory. Their surface calm enough to hide the history beneath. But below that stillness lies the forest, the town of Ferguson, and the memory of what progress submerged. The land may be gone, the story remains, carried in the water and in the people who remember. Next time on Made in Carolina, we follow the people who moved with the water, tracing how families rebuilt, remembered, and redefined what home meant after the flood. You've been listening to Made in Carolina, created, produced, and hosted by me, Lily Terrell, featuring Dr. Robert Hart, original music by Sister Sai, website by Tiffany Macer-Bass, with production support from Syra Riza. Visit madeincarolinapodcast.com for show notes and more stories waiting under the water.